When we imagine a medieval castle today, we tend to picture it from the outside. The towers, the battlements, the great gate. We picture it in daylight, or perhaps in the dramatic light of a siege. What we rarely picture is what it looked like at 10 o'clock on a January night, when the temperature outside had dropped below freezing, when the wind pressed against the walls with cold persistence, and when the hundreds of people who called this place home had to find a way to sleep until morning. The medieval castle was not primarily a military installation. It was, above all else, a home, a complex, hierarchical, densely populated home that had to function as a working community through every season of the year. The same walls that were designed to resist a battering ram also had to retain enough warmth to keep its inhabitants alive through winters that, in northern Europe, could be genuinely brutal. The same towers built to provide archers with clear sight lines also had to serve as sleeping quarters, storage rooms, and sometimes chapels. Understanding how medieval people survived the cold nights inside these structures requires us to look not at castles as monuments, but as machines for living. The physics of a stone castle in winter are, at first glance, deeply discouraging. Stone is an excellent conductor of heat, which means it absorbs warmth slowly and loses it quickly. A wall 3 feet thick made of limestone or granite will feel cold to the touch even on a summer morning, because the stone's interior temperature lags days or weeks behind the outside air. In winter, the same thermal mass that made stone walls so effective at staying cool in summer worked against the people living inside them. The walls were not just cold. They were, in a very real sense, actively drawing heat out of any room they enclosed. And yet people lived in these buildings for centuries. They raised children in them, grew old in them, conducted the full range of human life within them, including sleeping through long northern winters without dying of hypothermia. How they did this is not a single story but a layered one, involving architecture, textiles, social organization, animal husbandry, fire management, and a deep practical wisdom about the relationship between human bodies and cold that the medieval world had developed over generations of direct experience. The first and most fundamental defense against the cold in a medieval castle was architectural. Castle designers, and by the high medieval period, the men who designed major fortifications were genuine specialists with sophisticated understanding of how buildings behaved, were acutely aware of the thermal challenges their structures posed. The solutions they developed were often elegant in their simplicity. The Great Hall was the thermal heart of any medieval castle. This large, high-ceilinged room, typically positioned along the inner wall of the castle's main enclosure, served as the primary communal gathering space, but its design was also deeply influenced by heating requirements. Great halls almost always included at least one large fireplace, and in grander establishments, 2 or more. These were not the decorative fireplaces of later centuries, designed primarily for visual effect. They were serious heat-producing engines, built wide and deep, designed to burn large logs continuously through the night and to throw heat as far into the room as their geometry allowed. The positioning of the Great Hall within the castle complex was rarely accidental. Architects consistently placed the hall against walls or towers that would benefit from the accumulated heat of neighboring structures. A hall built into the angle between 2 towers, for instance, had 3 of its walls partially insulated by the mass of the towers on either side. The ground beneath the hall, if it had been occupied for any length of time, retained some thermal memory of years of fires above it. Even the orientation of windows, which in early medieval structures were simply holes in the wall, sealed at best with wooden shutters or oiled cloth, was considered in relation to prevailing winter winds. The development of the solar or great chamber represents one of the most significant architectural responses to the problem of winter cold. The solar was a private room, positioned above the Great Hall or in an adjacent tower, reserved for the Lord and his immediate family. Its elevation was not accidental. Heat rises. A room positioned directly above a well-used Great Hall could benefit significantly from the warmth generated below, especially if the floor construction allowed any thermal transfer. The solar also typically had its own fireplace, smaller than the Great Halls, but sufficient for a room that housed only a handful of people, and its windows were smaller and more carefully positioned than the halls, reducing the surface area through which cold air could penetrate. By the 13th and 14th centuries, castle architects had developed sophisticated systems of interior passages and mural chambers, rooms built within the thickness of the walls themselves. These spaces, tucked between the outer and inner faces of walls that might be 10 or 12 feet thick, were naturally insulated by the stone surrounding them on multiple sides. They were small, often used as garderobes or private chapels, but their thermal properties were well understood. A person sleeping in a mural chamber on a cold night was surrounded by stone that, while cold, at least blocked the direct assault of wind and outdoor air on 3 or 4 sides simultaneously. Fire was, of course, the primary technology of medieval heating, as it had been since before the first stone was laid in any human structure. But the management of fire in a medieval castle was a far more sophisticated enterprise than simply lighting a log and waiting for warmth. It was a skilled craft, practiced by dedicated servants, governed by strict protocols, and organized around a deep understanding of how different types of wood burned and how fire behaved in different architectural contexts. The wood supply for a major medieval castle was a logistical undertaking comparable in scale to its food supply. A large establishment might burn dozens of cartloads of wood each winter week. The selection of wood was not casual. Different species had dramatically different burning characteristics. Oak burned hot and long, making it ideal for the large fires needed to heat a great hall through the night. Beech produced a clean, hot flame with relatively little smoke. Ash famously burned well even when green, a valuable property in a world where managing wood stores through a long winter was a constant challenge. Softwoods like pine burned fast and bright, but were consumed quickly and threw more sparks, making them suitable for kindling, but less desirable for overnight heating. The management of fire through the night was the responsibility of specific servants whose role existed precisely for this purpose. In a major household, the marshalsea or hallkeeper was responsible for ensuring that fires were maintained through the dark hours. The technique used for overnight burning, known as banking, involved carefully covering the main body of glowing embers with ash before the household retired. This insulating layer of ash reduced the fire's oxygen supply, slowing combustion to a near stop while preserving a core of live coals that could be revived in the morning with minimal effort. A properly banked fire could maintain live coals for 8 or 10 hours, providing both a modest continued heat output through the night and a reliable means of rekindling the morning fire without the laborious process of fire starting from scratch. Central hearths, open fires built in the middle of a floor, with smoke escaping through a hole or louver in the roof above, preceded the wall fireplace as the standard heating method in great halls. Archaeological evidence suggests that many early medieval great halls used this arrangement, which had the advantage of radiating heat in all directions but the obvious disadvantage of filling the lower part of the room with central hearths, open fires built in the middle of a floor, with smoke escaping through a hole or louver in the roof above, preceded the wall fireplace as the standard heating method in great halls. Archaeological evidence suggests that many early medieval great halls used this arrangement, which had the advantage of radiating heat in all directions but the obvious disadvantage of filling the lower part of the room with portable heating devices supplemented fixed fireplaces throughout the medieval period. braziers, metal containers holding burning charcoal, could be moved from room to room as needed, providing targeted heat where a fireplace was absent or insufficient. Charcoal, produced by slowly burning wood with limited oxygen to drive off water and volatile compounds, burned hotter and cleaner than raw wood, making it preferable for enclosed spaces where smoke management was critical. Foot warmers, small ceramic or metal containers holding hot coals or heated stones, were carried by individuals to provide personal warmth in drafty rooms or during travel. Heated stones, wrapped in cloth, served as early bed warmers, placed between the sheets before retiring to take the edge off the cold linen. If fire was the castle's first defense against the cold, textiles were its second, and in many ways its more intimate one. The medieval world's relationship with fabric was entirely different from our own. Textiles were enormously expensive, painstakingly produced, and understood with a depth of practical knowledge that has few parallels in modern consumer culture. The same society that built stone castles also developed, over centuries, a sophisticated understanding of how to use fabric to manage body heat, an understanding that informed everything from the design of sleeping arrangements to the organization of the household. Wool was the dominant textile of the medieval world, and its thermal properties made it ideally suited to the conditions of castle life. Unlike linen or cotton, wool fibers have a natural crimp that traps air in tiny pockets within the fabric, and trapped air is one of the most effective thermal insulators available. Wool also has the remarkable property of remaining insulating even when damp, a critical advantage in environments where the combination of cold stone walls and human breath could produce significant condensation. A person wrapped in a wool blanket on a cold night retained far more body heat than the temperature of the surrounding air would suggest possible. The great bed of a medieval lord or lady was nothing like the simple frame and mattress construction we might imagine. It was, in the wealthiest households, a substantial piece of furniture representing significant capital investment, and its construction was engineered for thermal performance with remarkable sophistication. The bed typically began with a wooden frame elevated above the cold floor, removing its occupants from the zone of coldest air that pooled near ground level. Over this frame was laid a palliasse, a large sack stuffed with straw or rushes, which provided both cushioning and a first layer of insulation from the cold wood below. Above the palliasse came a feather bed, a thick mattress stuffed with goose or duck down, the finest insulating material available in the pre-industrial world. The covers of a noble bed were correspondingly elaborate. Multiple layers of blankets, typically of wool, were supplemented in wealthy households by fur-lined coverlets, great quilted or padded covers, sometimes lined with the pelts of squirrel, mink, or in the grandest establishments, ermine. The value of these coverings was considerable. Inventories of medieval noble estates regularly list bed textiles among the most valuable items in the household, comparable in worth to jewelry or plate. A set of fine bed hangings and coverlets might represent more monetary value than the bed frame itself. The bed hangings, the curtains that enclosed the bed on all four sides and above, were not merely decorative. They served a critical thermal function, creating a small enclosed space within the larger room that could be significantly warmer than the surrounding air. The body heat of the sleepers, contained within the curtained enclosure, raised the temperature of that microenvironment noticeably. A well-curtained bed with good coverings, occupied by two people, could maintain an interior temperature 10 or 15 degrees warmer than the room outside the curtains. This was not a trivial difference on a midwinter night in a stone tower. Sleeping arrangements in the castle also reflected the social organization of medieval life in ways that had direct thermal implications. For the great majority of castle inhabitants, the servants, soldiers, and workers who made the establishment function, sleeping alone in a private room was neither possible nor desirable. The great hall, after the evening meal was cleared, became a dormitory. Bodies were laid close, together on straw or rushes near the fire, sharing warmth in the direct, unself-conscious way that communal sleeping cultures around the world have always done. The thermal logic was simple and effective. A room full of sleeping bodies generates substantial heat, and bodies lying close together share that heat among themselves far more efficiently than the same number of people sleeping separately. The medieval approach to winter cold was not purely architectural and textile. It was also metabolic, a recognition expressed not in scientific language, but in deeply embedded practical tradition, that the human body's capacity to generate its own heat could be supported and enhanced through diet, activity, and proximity to other warm-blooded creatures. The winter diet of castle inhabitants was substantially richer in fats and calories than their summer diet, and this was not accidental. The autumn slaughter, the killing of livestock that could not be fed through the winter, produced large quantities of salted and smoked meat, lard, and tallow that formed a significant portion of the winter food supply. This diet, so often criticized by modern commentators as unhealthy, was in fact a rational metabolic adaptation to cold. The human body burns fat to generate heat. A diet high in animal fats supports this thermogenic process directly. Medieval people may not have understood the biochemistry, but they knew from experience that a man who ate well through winter was less likely to suffer from cold than one who did not. Hot food and drink were consumed with a frequency and emphasis that modern accounts of medieval diets sometimes understate. Pottages, thick stews of grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat were consumed at virtually every meal, and their warmth was valued as much as their nutritional content. Ale and wine, warmed by the addition of hot water or a heated iron plunged directly into the liquid, were regular features of winter evenings. Spiced wines, the predecessors of modern mulled wine, combined the warming properties of hot liquid with the circulatory effects of spices such as ginger, cinnamon, and cloves, which were believed, correctly or not, to generate internal heat. Animals played a role in castle heating that is rarely discussed in popular histories, but is well attested in the archaeological and documentary record. The lowest levels of many castle towers and outbuildings housed livestock, horses, cattle, sheep, and pigs, and the heat generated by these animals was substantial. A stable containing 20 horses generates as much heat as several large fires. Castle architects in Northern Europe frequently positioned stables and byres in locations where their waste heat could benefit adjacent human habitations. The smell was considerable, and medieval sensibilities about this were more tolerant than modern ones. But the warmth was real and significant. Dogs were constant companions in the medieval Great Hall, and their thermal contribution was not negligible. Large hunting dogs, of which a noble household might keep dozens, were permitted, indeed encouraged, to sleep near and among the people in the hall. The phrase, three-dog night, meaning a night cold enough to require the body warmth of 3 dogs to stay comfortable, has roots in the practical sleeping customs of pre-modern societies across many cultures. Medieval accounts of Great Hall life regularly mention dogs as a ubiquitous feature of the sleeping space. Their presence tolerated precisely because their warmth was valued. The management of the body's own heat generation through physical activity in the evening hours before sleep was also, it appears, a recognized strategy. Medieval accounts of winter evenings in great halls consistently emphasize the role of dancing, games, and physical activity, pursuits that we might categorize as entertainment, but that also served the practical function of raising the body's core temperature before the period of reduced activity that sleep entailed. A person who danced vigorously for an hour before retiring to a curtained bed with good wool blankets was in a substantially better thermal position than one who had sat motionless through the evening. The medieval understanding of clothing was fundamentally different from modern notions of fashion or even simple practicality. Clothing was understood as a second skin, a constructed environment worn on the body that modulated the relationship between the body's heat and the surrounding air. The sophistication with which medieval garment makers approached this problem deserves considerably more recognition than it typically receives. The medieval understanding of clothing was fundamentally different from modern notions of fashion or even simple practicality. Clothing was understood as a second skin, a constructed environment worn on the body that modulated the relationship between the body's heat and the surrounding air. The sophistication with which medieval garment makers approached this problem deserves considerably more recognition than it typically receives. The layering principle, wearing multiple thinner garments rather than a single thick one, was central to medieval cold weather dressing. The innermost layer, typically of linen, absorbed perspiration and protected the outer garments from body oils that would reduce their insulating effectiveness over time. Above this came one or more layers of wool, each trapping its own layer of air. The outermost garment, a cloak, mantle, or houppelande, served as a windbreak, reducing the convective heat loss that cold air movement against the body would otherwise cause. Sleeping in one's clothes, or in a garment specifically designed for sleeping, was standard practice throughout the medieval period for virtually all social classes. The modern concept of sleeping in minimal or no clothing in a warm bedroom was simply not available to most medieval people. Nightgowns, loose, long garments of wool or linen, were worn to bed by those who could afford them. Others slept in the undergarments they had worn through the day. Either practice kept the body's immediate thermal environment significantly stable than bearskin against cold linen would have allowed. Head coverings for sleep were universal, and their thermal rationale was sound. The human head loses a disproportionate amount of body heat relative to its surface area, because the brain requires constant blood flow, and that blood must be maintained at a stable temperature. A wool cap worn to sleep reduced this heat loss significantly. Medieval illuminations consistently depict sleepers wearing close-fitting wool caps, and the documentary record confirms that such caps were among the most basic items of personal clothing owned even by the poorest members of medieval society. Footwear similarly reflected a sophisticated understanding of thermal management. The feet are among the body's most vulnerable extremities in cold conditions, as the circulatory system naturally reduces blood flow to extremities to protect core temperature when cold stress increases. Medieval people wore their stockings and hose to bed in cold weather, and some accounts describe the use of thick felt shoes or slippers specifically designed for nighttime wear, not for walking, but for the passive insulation of feet that might otherwise be exposed to the cold air beneath the bed coverings. The layering principle, wearing multiple thinner garments rather than a single thick one, was central to medieval cold weather dressing. The innermost layer, typically of linen, absorbed perspiration and protected the outer garments from body oils that would reduce their insulating effectiveness over time. Above this came one or more layers of wool, each trapping its own layer of air. The outermost garment, a cloak, mantle, or houppelande, served as a windbreak, reducing the convective heat loss that cold air movement against the body would otherwise cause. Sleeping in one's clothes, or in a garment specifically designed for sleeping, was standard practice throughout the medieval period for virtually all social classes. The modern concept of sleeping in minimal or no clothing in a warm bedroom was simply not available to most medieval people. Nightgowns, loose, long garments of wool or linen, were worn to bed by those who could afford them. Others slept in the undergarments they had worn through the day. Either practice kept the body's immediate thermal environment significantly than bearskin against cold linen would have allowed. Head coverings for sleep were universal, and their thermal rationale was sound. The human head loses a disproportionate amount of body heat relative to its surface area, because the brain requires constant blood flow, and that blood must be maintained at a stable temperature. A wool cap worn to sleep reduced this heat loss significantly. Medieval illuminations consistently depict sleepers wearing close-fitting wool caps, and the documentary record confirms that such caps were among the most basic items of personal clothing owned even by the poorest members of medieval society. Footwear similarly reflected a sophisticated understanding of thermal management. The feet are among the body's most vulnerable extremities in cold conditions, as the circulatory system naturally reduces blood flow to extremities to protect core temperature when cold stress increases. Medieval people wore their stockings and hose to bed in cold weather, and some accounts describe the use of thick felt shoes or slippers specifically designed for nighttime wear, not for walking, but for the passive insulation of feet that might otherwise be exposed to the cold air beneath the bed coverings. Perhaps the most striking aspect of cold management in medieval castles, to modern eyes, is how thoroughly it was organized around social hierarchy. Warmth in the medieval castle was not equally distributed. It was allocated according to rank, with the most comfortable sleeping conditions reserved for those at the top of the social order, and the least comfortable endured by those at the bottom, a pattern that was understood, accepted, and in some respects actively maintained as an expression of social order. The lord and lady of the castle slept in the greatest warmth available, a private room with its own fireplace, a bed with full curtains and fine coverings, access to the best wool blankets and fur coverlets. Their closest attendants, ladies-in-waiting, personal servants, senior household officers, slept in adjacent spaces that shared proximity to the Lord's chamber, if not its full amenities. They might sleep on pallets laid on the floor of the solar, benefiting from the room's warmth after the Lord's fire had been banked for the night. The arrangement was intimate by modern standards, but its thermal logic was clear. Further down the hierarchy, sleeping conditions deteriorated in direct proportion to social standing, but in a way that was managed rather than simply neglected. The Great Hall was not a comfortable sleeping space by any modern measure, but it was a supervised and organized one. Straw was laid fresh on the floors at intervals. The hall's fire was maintained through the night. The press of bodies generated collective warmth. Medieval descriptions of the Great Hall at night emphasize not misery but community, a shared space where the cold was met communally, and where the presence of many sleeping bodies made the cold less absolute than it would have been for any individual sleeping alone. Castle chapels presented a particular challenge and a particular solution. Religious observance in the medieval castle required attendance at multiple daily services, including early morning prayer at hours when the cold was most intense. The architectural response was the development of heated antechambers and the use of charcoal braziers within the chapel space itself, solutions that preserved the religious function while acknowledging the biological reality of the people performing it. Some castle chapels were positioned within the main building complex in ways that allowed them to benefit from the heat of adjacent inhabited spaces, their walls warmed by the proximity of the Great Hall or the kitchens. The castle kitchens were, in thermal terms, among the most valuable spaces in any medieval establishment. Fires burned in the kitchen from before dawn until well after dark throughout the winter, not for warmth per se, but for cooking, and the incidental heat they generated was enormous. Kitchen workers slept near their fires, and the spaces immediately adjacent to kitchen complexes were consistently among the warmest in any castle. Documents from medieval household accounts occasionally reveal the informal arrangement by which certain privileged servants secured sleeping spots near the kitchen fires, a perk that mixed social recognition with straightforward thermal advantage. There is something instructive, perhaps even humbling, in the recognition that the people who built and inhabited the great stone castles of medieval Europe were not victims of their climate, but its active managers. They did not possess our technologies, but they possessed something that their technologies could not have replaced: a direct, daily, embodied relationship with cold that produced practical wisdom of remarkable sophistication. They understood that warmth was not a property of buildings but of systems, systems involving architecture, fire, fabric, food, animals, and above all, the proximity of other warm-blooded human beings. They understood that the cold of a winter night was not a single problem to be solved by a single technology, but a complex challenge, requiring layered, redundant responses that compensated for each other's limitations. They understood, in ways that our centrally heated, individually sleeping, temperature-controlled modern lives have made it easy to forget, that keeping warm was fundamentally a collective enterprise. The castles they built still stand in considerable numbers across Europe, their stone walls as cold as ever, their fireplaces long cold, their tapestries mostly gone. Visitors who walk through them in winter can feel, viscerally, what it would have meant to live in these spaces. The weight of the cold radiating from walls that have not been warmed by fire in centuries. The way the chill pools in lower rooms and presses through gaps in windows and doors. It is useful to feel this. It is useful to stand in the great hall of a medieval castle on a January afternoon and understand that the hundreds of people who lived their lives in this space were not medieval in their capacity to feel cold. They were human beings, exactly as cold-sensitive as we are, who found ways to survive and even to flourish in conditions that most modern people would find intolerable. The answers they found were not always elegant by modern standards. They involved smoke and smell, crowding and discomfort, strict hierarchies of warmth and privilege that reflected the inequalities of their society. But they worked, generation after generation, through winters that were sometimes significantly colder than anything most modern Europeans experience. The inhabitants of medieval castles slept through the night and woke to kindle their fires and begin again. Their methods were not primitive. They were the accumulated intelligence of a cold world, encoded in stone and wool and the careful management of fire. We have inherited their castles. We have, perhaps, something to learn from the people who once kept them warm.